There it is. All right, we're here. We're back. It's another beautiful week, especially if you live in San Diego. I'll tell you what. But today's guest is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to talk about communication and boundaries and how this all applies. Obviously, too obvious, right? We're going to get into it. It's going to be a lot of fun. Hang tight.
Practicing polyamory, real-life perspectives from the imperfect people of polyamory. The mission of the Practicing Polyamory podcast is to provide a platform for all of the real-life, flawed humans that practice polyamory so that we might all learn from one another and grow as a community. Enjoy the show.
All right, here we go. Welcome, everybody to the show. Before we jump in, I just want to quickly thank everyone again who subscribed on YouTube. I really appreciate every single one of you. We can find it on youtube.com/practicingpolyA. Hooray! We're everywhere on social at Practicing PolyA, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Twitch, wherever it is that you can think of us. That's probably where we are, Practicing PolyA everywhere. And if you are listening right now on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever, whatever other podcast app, would really love if you could go subscribe and leave a review wherever it is that you download the pod. All right. And secondly, I always want to remind everybody, if you are listening to this podcast, you are a welcome guest to be on this show. If you're actively polyamorous, polyam curious, or a professional serving the polyamorous community, I want to hear your story. If you are disabled, BIPOC, pan, bi, demi, gay, straight, sex worker, kinkster, queer, lesbian, trans, NB, arrow, ace, whatever. We want to hear your story. The more stories we hear, the more the world learns about us, the more representation we have, and the better we can serve our community. All right, that is my spiel. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get on with the show. Our guest today is a master certified life coach who chose to be a coach because she believes it fills a necessary gap between self-sufficiency and needing therapy. She's constantly inspired by her clients' courage and commitment, understanding that sometimes just showing up at her office is an act of courage. Her work is her passion. Helping clients and seeing transformations is one of the most fulfilling parts of her life. She's been an ally to the polyam and LGBTQ community for years and provides a respectful, affirming, validating space to offer solution-focused coaching that keeps maximizing your potential to grow. Now, all relationships exist on a foundation of communication and boundaries. Many relationships problems occur because or are amplified by poor communication and unclear boundaries. So whether you come as an individual, a couple, or as part of a polycule, you can work together to create strong, positive communication, set meaningful boundaries in any relationship. Joining us today from life coach Round Rock out of Round Rock, Texas. Welcome to the show, Angela. Hey.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela. Thanks for making time out of your day to hang out with me a bit. Really appreciate it. Tell me, first of all, just a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your history, getting to the point of where you are. What inspired you to choose this trajectory?
Oh, goodness. So as you just so clearly outlined, I'm a master certified life coach and a licensed marriage and family therapist. And a lot of things landed me on this path. The simple story is that I spent a lot of time in therapy myself, and it was very helpful. And I realized that my experiences of life were something that inspired me to want to help other people to find the peace and life happiness that I found along my own journey, and wanting to be a part of that for other people. And if you ever talk to any life coaches and therapists, the really common thing that they will all say is we're the kind of person that people like to talk to across the board. So like, it's just one of those base things. Like, if people are going to talk to you about their stuff anyways, what you really want is to know what to do about that.
Yes. Oh my God. Yes. I find the same thing if people do want to talk to me about things, I feel like I'm not a great advice giver. So like, that would be my problem. If I was ever going to do something like what you do, I would want to learn like what to do.
You want the training. What do you do with all that stuff that they just told you? Yeah.
Exactly. So how long is that process, and what all did you have to go through to get to where you are now?
Well, it all sort of depends on what you're doing. Because my goal was to eventually have a license, counseling license. There's like a lot of hoops, is how I like to call it. You have to jump through. So you need a bachelor's degree of some sort. I got mine in psychology, and then you need a master's degree. I got mine in marriage family therapy, but there are other options. For life coaching, it's a similar trajectory in terms of like you're working with people and creating a life that they're happy with. You're just kind of working in a different platform. So with life coaching, you're looking more at like life skills and having a neutral. I think the biggest thing life coaching does is provide somebody a bouncing board that who's not invested in what choices you're making in your life. Our friends and our family love us, and they have thoughts and opinions about what's best for us that may not match our own, which sometimes makes those difficult places to kind of take that energy. And life coaching kind of steps into that space because we're not a part of your life, and so we don't really care what choices you ultimately make.
Right.
So that gives you a unique position to be able to give information or provide amplification on skill sets so that people can go into their life and really thrive.
Got it. And talking about becoming a life coach, and you said that there's a gap between self-sufficiency and therapy, and you need a kind of a life coach to help fill that gap. My question is, what is the difference between a life coach and a therapist? Like, how do I
That's a
differentiate?
really good question. That's a really good question that a lot of people ask. And I think it's a really important question because they overlap a little bit. There is a fuzzy line between them. In the same way, there's a fuzzy line between going to a trusted friend and going to a life coach. There's a fuzzy line between those two.
Mhm.
What makes something definitively on one side versus the other is whether or not there are mental health components that are happening. So a person who has depression can also have communication challenges, right? So if they're coming and their goal is to work on their depression, that's a mental health goal, even if there are also communication challenges happening.
Got it.
If the goal is to work on their communication challenges, that's a life coaching goal. That's something you can work on in life coaching. If the depression is complicating that and you can't talk about the one without the other, that tips it all the way into therapy, if that sort of makes sense.
Yeah, it
So
absolutely does.
a perfectly healthy person who is functioning in most domains in their life, who just has some challenges, might find life coaching to be a perfect fit in them kind of overcoming whatever those are. If there's mental health components, you need someone who has that additional training, and it's a lot. I mean, a master's degree requires you to do a lot of training, a lot of work. And part of that is because a person who is struggling with some mental health concerns is more vulnerable. And so a life coach may not have the skill set to interact with that person without causing further damage. So like you really do need that additional training when you're tipping into mental health stuff. So that's the major line.
That's the major line. That's the big thing. And I'm interested and I'm curious, especially because I actually just got myself a life coach, or I'll call her a life coach, just like last week. And that same day that I spoke with her and like signed up with her, I made an appointment for therapy. I'm like, I right now I just need somebody to talk to because I'm like going crazy inside my own head. And not sure which route is going to be the right one. Let me try both.
And they should be different.
Together.
I do want to be clear. They should be different. If you have a life coach who's doing therapy, they're practicing outside their scope of practice and should not be doing that.
Got it. I mean, good to know. And I'm not saying that she will or she won't.
No,
I have no idea
hopefully
yet.
You found someone who's very ethical and well trained, and she'll be doing what she's supposed to be doing. But yeah, they're supposed to be different. And I've had conversations for both sides. I've had therapists who did not have training in life coaching go and try to do that, and that's equally problematic. So like it's important to have training and be practicing within your scope of practice, and to be clear that you're working with the client on the goals they have for the work, regardless of which one of those side of the line you're on.
Now that brings up a good question. Why? I mean, I guess I can see more clearly why a life coach trying to practice therapy or help with mental health issues, to me, that's a more definitive, like, oh yeah, you should not be stepping into that realm. But on the other side, a therapist trying to take a life coach type of
You
role,
can.
why would you say that wouldn't be recommended?
Not so much not recommended as it is make sure you have training for it. A therapist, by definition, usually has all the skill set to do life coaching work, but it kind of depends on the modality. So there are different sort of frameworks, if you will, that therapists and life coaches work from. And some of them lend themselves more to coaching versus therapy than others. So I work from a solution-focused framework, which means I use solution-focused brief therapy and coaching. The framework for that is the same on both sides of that line. So the way that I work with clients fits regardless of whether or not we have a coaching goal or a therapy goal.
Can you dig into that?
So
Can you dig into that a little bit more? The solution-focused therapy. Can you give me like some more explicit examples of what that means?
Yes. So the short version of that is that a solution-focused brief therapist or solution-focused coach is always working from a foundation of respect and a belief that the client, one, is completely capable, two, that they are already doing things that are helping themselves, and that change does not necessarily mean, the better way to phrase that? So the solution is not necessarily connected with the problem. We like to think our culture is very problem-centered. We feel like there's a right way to go about solving a problem. You need to dig into the problem. You need to research the problem. You need to problem solve. And this modality says none of that's actually necessary. That when change happens more on a circle. If you change one part, other parts automatically start changing. It's dominoes. It doesn't matter where you start a change process. It impacts everything else. So I don't necessarily have to do anything about the problem in order for change to happen. I just have to get progress in one area and it causes change everywhere else.
Oh, I love that. It's like light bulb going off in my head right there. I do have the perfect clip for that. Watch this.
That's a good movie.
That's a great movie.
Yeah. So when you think if you think back over your life, over times where something was going on and then a flip got switched. So a switch got flipped. Let me flip that around. If you think back to that, right, and you think about what was it that caused that change to occur, and it's usually random stuff. I can think back for myself, my view of myself as attractive. That's a non sequitur, but there was a movie that flipped that switch for me. I remember, and it didn't, completely change everything, but it was the beginning of that change in how I saw myself. And it was a movie. No one could have said, your problem is this, and you need to go watch this movie. It's going to change that. Like, that wasn't the way it worked. Oh, my apologies. So you never know, like, what's going to start that change process. But having a conversation, which again is the idea behind solution-focused brief therapy and coaching, is we're going to have a conversation that looks at how is that process already happening, and what do you already have within yourself, or maybe in another domain of your life, that we can pull into the situation to amplify that change.
Interesting. So there's like an idea, what it sounds like to me, that there are areas in your life where you are strong in, and using some of the traits from those strength areas, you can kind of maneuver it and use some of those same habits or some of those same processes, whatever, thinking to work on whatever that specific problem that you're trying to solve.
That's almost always a given. There's almost always some part of your life that's working, even when you're having challenges in another area. So what are you doing in that area that's helping you function or cope or thrive? And if you took some of that and put it over here, what difference would that make?
Nice. Very cool. Very cool. All right. So getting into the big two things that we started talking about, communication and boundaries. Now, obviously, especially in our polyam relationships, polycules, all this good stuff, like, this is huge. This is everything that we talk about. It's the big three, right? Communication, communication, communication. That's all we talk about. And I think, a lot of people, when we get into our polyamorous relationships, when we start opening up and start learning, we do all kinds of research. We read a bunch of books. We listen to a bunch of podcasts, and we keep hearing that over and over and over and over again. So when we come to a life coach and we say, hey, we're still having issues in our relationship, we have done everything that we can to try and improve communication, but there's some kind of a blockage, there's something going on. Where's the foundation? What do we start with to make sure that we have good communication skills?
Honestly, my first question is going to be, what's going on in the times where you are communicating well? Because there always is. I have couples or polycules come and we're having communication problems now, but how did you get together? There's usually positive communication happening then. How did you form this relationship or get far enough into it to even be in a place where you're trying to save it? At some point, good communication was happening. So what was going on then, right, in that area of your life in that time that we can pull into now? So like what was working that we can, turn the volume back up on?
That makes sense. I mean, it's really, I listen to Abraham Hicks pretty often, and I don't know if you've listened to her at all, but they talk about when there's certain areas of your life that aren't working. It's like going back and focusing on the things that are working. And you keep kind of going back to that. And so in my mind, I'm thinking of like the dating process, right? Early on, you start flirting at the bar or the concert or wherever it is that you met, and there's good communication there. And then the breakdown just kind of comes later, and you just take them back to that mindset when they.
Well, I mean, not that I'm not into digging into the problem, but if we look at that, if we flip that over and look at what happened, right? Usually how we got from that place where we're flirting and we're communicating well to a point where there's a problem, usually what's going on is that there are mistaken assumptions happening. We now believe we know the person well enough that we stop checking in. We assume we know what they're saying. And that's fine if we're assuming positive things. But if we're making negative assumptions about the other person's motivation or what they mean, that creates this distance. More often than not, when I have someone that I'm working with in my office, well, not right now. Right now we're doing digital, but when I'm working with people and there's communication problems, there's almost always mistaken assumptions that are happening to the extent where I'm listening to the people talk and I'm going, you're hearing very different things that I'm hearing from them, but I don't have this background assumptions that are going on. So it's very useful in those moments to check in and go, here's what I'm hearing you say. Am I understanding you accurately? Is that what you heard? And if not, where's that coming from?
Yeah, that's part of the nonviolent communication stuff, right? Using eye language, repeating back the things that I think I heard.
That's one, taking ownership of your own thoughts and feelings, and that's checking in. And that's based on some foundational relationship assumptions. And like, I try to be very, very respectful of what other people are bringing and how they've defined their relationships. But I have to bring myself to my work, and there's not really any way to not do that.
Sure.
So there are some foundational assumptions that I make about what is required for a healthy relationship. And one of those is that there's respect for each person's point of view, that you each come with a valid perspective on the world that you may not share.
So go ahead, please.
Well, that you have to come from that place. So if I start off believing that you have a valid point of view and that it is just as valid as mine, even if we don't share it, it changes the way I'm communicating with you. It changes the assumptions I'm going to make about what you're saying. If I come to that with the valid belief that everybody has this right to say yes or no, that changes the dynamic. If I come to a relationship with the belief that I have and they have the right to ask for their needs to be met, which goes along with that everybody has the right to say yes and no, those two go together, right? That changes the dynamic. It creates a foundation of respect for the relationship, respect for the other person, and respect for yourself.
I'm sitting here thinking and listening, and there's a couple of things. It's one that you and I are two different people.
Mm-hmm.
Myself and my partner are two different people. We can all look at the same thing. We can all look at this bell, right? Or whatever, a movie, a quote, and
Mm-hmm.
take something different away from it. We can all look at a situation, and we each have our viewpoint, and each of our viewpoints are influenced by our past experiences, by our
Absolutely.
future expectations,
Absolutely.
by our current mental status, like all these
Well, our
different
past
things.
experiences with other people, as well as our past experiences with the person we're with, right? So my interpretation of the words that you're saying, which we always do, right? So the idea that you're not going to make assumptions is impossible. We have to, in order to communicate. I have to make the assumption that I'm understanding the words coming out of your mouth in order for us to even have a communication. So the assumptions are a given. But if I'm starting from a place of assuming positive things about you, then I'm filtering that through there. But everything I hear you say, I'm filtering through my past experiences with other people. When I look at the things you do and I make assumptions about your motivation and your meaning and what matters to you, I'm filtering that through my previous experiences with you and my experiences with other people.
So we're taking all of this information all at once and filtering it and coming up with whatever result.
Yes, which is why checking in is so important.
Checking in
linguistically. So I'm hearing you say this is what I'm taking from that. Am I understanding you accurately? Yes or no? And we do that, like going back to our previous conversation of taking the clients back to that moment when they were communicating well. You do those things in the beginning. You assume positive things about the other person. You assume that if you're having a negative communication, that there's a misunderstanding happening. And so you check in. You automatically will do those things because you don't know them well enough at that point to make those assumptions. So you don't do it as much.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So checking in can be very powerful. And you don't necessarily have to do that in your entire relationship all the time. When I teach positive communication strategies, we get into like deep, like you're doing like all the minutia. And you don't have to do that all the time. When you're communicating well with each other, when you're on the same page, you can short circuit that to a certain extent. My best friend and I, when we're talking to each other, we say parts of sentences and we get each other and like we're on the same page and like we jump around a lot. It drives my husband crazy. He's like, I don't even know what you guys are talking about because she's saying this and I jump over here and he's like, what are you even doing? Like she gets it. She knows exactly what I'm talking about. Right. Yep. So that goes well. But then when it breaks down, it breaks down. So we had, arranged plans at one point and we both thought we knew what the other person's intent was and we arrived at different locations. So like checking in.
That check-in would have been good right then.
The check-in would have been good. That this is what I understand we're doing. So like, and knowing where in your relationship a check-in is appropriate. So she and I can go off on separate parts about this, but when we're planning something, we have to check in with each other. Otherwise, we make erroneous assumptions about some of the pieces of it.
Oops.
For instance, who's picking up who, right? That was where that one happened. So checking in is super, super important.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, it absolutely is. And not just checking in with our partners, but now bounce into boundaries, checking in with ourselves. And this is something that I talked about a little bit last week. It came up last week. When it comes to boundaries, my partner has her list like written out. She has a bunch of stuff, written down. She knows exactly, what her boundaries are. Me, I like know one, right? And it's because of something that happened pretty recently, where I just know that if there's infidelity in any way, shape, or form, like I'm not about it. I'm out. Don't even, that's a boundary, right? So like that's one that I can think of off the top of my head.
That takes us right into like the whole flow of our conversation, though. Number one, How would you define an infidelity?
Oh, you're actually asking me?
Well, you don't necessarily have to answer that question. This is not you don't necessarily have to answer that question, but you have to think about going back to like, are we on the same page? And I think this takes us back to the polyamorous community as well, right? What each person means by poly can be very different. One person's expression and participation in poly can be very different from other people. So when you're meeting someone and you both go, well, yeah, I'm poly. Oh, I'm poly too. How cool. You might be talking about very different things. So when you say one of my boundaries is infidelity, right? You would have to then have a conversation about what does that even mean? Because I've had clients where one person defined infidelity as even viewing pornography, right? They considered that an infidelity.
Right. Whereas somebody else will say, no, you're like making out is an infidelity, or like going all the way to having sex. That's the infidelity, or emotional
infidelity, right? So like how you define where that boundary actually sits for you is personal and particular. So if you're not communicating about that, the other person may make a completely different understanding because how they define infidelity is different.
Nice.
And perfectly valid, I'd like to point out. That's where that assumption of each person has their own point of view, their own perspective, that's valid. So each person's definition of infidelity is perfectly valid. But if you don't communicate about that and you're not clear about where each other's boundaries are and checking in, then you're going to end up in a conflict. And the other piece of that is once you've had that conversation, right? I define infidelity this way and you define infidelity that way. Then it gives you a room to have a negotiation. How are we going to marry those two for this relationship? How does that relate to how we're setting boundaries? If I'm defining infidelity as, an emotional infidelity, like if you go even over that, that's an infidelity for me, right? Then even if you only define infidelity as physical interactions, right? Then we have to discuss, well, how are we going to clarify that boundary? And then you get to choose, right? Whether or not you're going to honor your partner's boundary or if you're going to let the relationship go because it's a deal breaker for you.
Wow, that gets really deep really fast.
Yeah.
It really is. It's if I like, how did you say? You said if I view infidelity as emotional cheating, right? So having like an emotional connection, but you view infidelity as just having sex with somebody else, and you're okay with having all of these other emotional connections.
Sometimes reversed, right? Sometimes it's the reverse. You can have all the sex you want, but if you have an emotional relationship.
Right, exactly. But either way, there's a coming together. There's like some kind of either a compromise that needs to happen, or one of those people needs to say, no, this isn't for me.
Yeah.
And that can get really tough.
Yeah. Well, I think sometimes that's why people avoid having those conversations.
For sure.
But when you don't, that's where you run into challenges down the way because you didn't have those conversations. Or sometimes people, again, more often than not, people don't think to have these conversations because they assume that everybody sees the world the same way they do.
Right.
That's generally true. Most people think everybody defines infidelity the same way. No, they don't.
I mean, I kind of think that there's like a baseline, like having sex with somebody without telling the other partner, like.
Well, but you go back to the poly community, right? And there are definitely poly versions of that relationship where that would not be considered an infidelity.
It's true. Don't ask, don't tell agreement would be fine. Boom. There it is. I love that. There's a lot of different ways of going about this, and while I do define, it's my responsibility, I should say, to define my own boundaries. By the same token, I do have to have these conversations, and getting kind of back to that, like defining my boundaries around maybe time spent with a partner. What are some other boundary conversations that you've had with your clients?
And I want to express that boundaries isn't just about defining what isn't, it's defining what is.
Okay.
So I like to think of this as this is the 80-20 list. Your boundaries are what you need to have in a relationship in order to be happy and healthy. And your boundaries are also what cannot be a part of the relationship in order for you to be happy and healthy.
Can you give me some examples?
So an example of things you need in a relationship might be, I need quality time with my partner. Or I need a certain amount of loving touch. Or, I need surprise presents. This takes us into love languages quite a bit.
Yeah.
But what do you need from your partner in order to be happy and healthy with that person. And for some people in the polyamorous community, right, that goes into what they need in terms of not just their relationship with this person, but with other people.
Mm-hmm.
So I need the freedom to express my sexuality in this way. I need the freedom to develop these relationships in order for me to be happy and healthy. So that's a boundary conversation. That's expressing your needs. And again, we go back to everybody has the right to ask for their needs to be met, and everybody has the right to say yes and no. So if I say this is something that's important to me, this is something I need, and the other person's like, that's not something that I can live with, or that's not something I can give you, then what do we do with that?
Mm-hmm. Do we continue this relationship
or do you find another way to get those needs met? And when you go back to boundaries, right, how are we defining the boundaries of this relationship? Often that's defined as who you can get your needs met with, right? Traditional monogamy, the boundary is defined as you can only get your social, your sexual and your emotional needs met with one partner.
Mm-hmm.
You can get your spiritual needs met from someone else. You can get your friendship needs met with someone else, but you can only get these needs met with this person. That's like traditional monogamy.
Mm-hmm.
You start opening that up in different ways, and that's how you kind of branch out to, an open relationship or swinging or polyamory, or like in the different flavors of polyamory, right? Is saying what kinds of needs and with whom can you get them met?
We have a little bit more freedom, but it does complicate things some.
Well, the more people you have in anything, the more complicated it gets, and the more important that communication becomes, right? If I have two people that are trying to articulate and communicate their boundaries and be clear, that's challenging. You add a third person, and now we need to be communicating and clear in several different areas. It becomes more important. The more people you add, the more important communication and being clear about your boundaries for yourself and for others becomes.
Yeah, I'll personal experience on that. I experienced that, and I'm sure a lot of people did during the past 12 months, and continuing on still until things clear up.
Stuck in each other's spaces in a way that they're not used to, where they're living on top of each other 24/7 in a way they're not used to. That put a lot of pressure on how do you define your space and my space, alone time. What's the balance between time for yourself and time for the other person? What's the expectations, where the boundaries on chores and how those things get done? So like that put a lot of pressure on those conversations. And if you had not had them before, it created conflict.
You were going to start having them now. And also, as you were saying, complicating it further with different partners, because now it's, keeping a household safe by not introducing or allowing other partners without, proper precautions and all that stuff. So,
well, and each person may be defining proper precautions differently.
That part right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a couple on a few weeks ago that one of them was not allowed back into their home because they went out to see a partner. And, you're absolutely right. What I consider safe and what somebody else considers safe is two different things. But, getting back to that communication, we have to be able to have those conversations and determine, where we're going to meet. Because if I think this person is just going way too far to one side, like, but I'm way too far on the other, we got to be able to meet somewhere in the middle.
Which starts with communication. Yeah.
I love it. Angela, thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful experience, getting to know you, getting to chat with you, learning about some foundations of communication and boundaries. Before we head off, if somebody would like to work with you as a life coach, help with their relationships, etc., and so on, how can people get in touch with you? Where should they go?
I'm really easy to find. You can visit lifecoachroundrock.com, all spelled exactly the way you'd expect it to. And there's information about my practice. There is, you can reach out to schedule a free consultation. I really, really like to do those because it gives everybody an opportunity to ask the questions they might have and to get to know me a little bit and see if I can actually help them with whatever they feel like they're bringing to the table. And you can schedule an intake session. That's the first thing. So do a consultation if you think that might be helpful for you. I do have some blog things up there. So feel free to go and look at those. But yeah, I love working with people. I love being able to help people. And I do try to come at that from a respectful space. I've had people contact me from the poly community saying, I just want someone I don't have to explain this to.
Yep.
Who's not going to try to talk me out of it or explain to me why, what I'm doing is the wrong thing to do. So like, I think it's so important that we have coaches and counselors who do understand how the community works and don't put the clients in the position of having to defend their life. That's something I try to do.
And you're not relegated only to Texas, right?
Well, yes. Unfortunately,
Okay.
that's the only challenge about being a licensed clinician is that it also limits my coaching practice. But if they are outside of Texas and they like the what I'm presenting, I do know clinicians all across the country who work from that solution-focused framework. So if that sounds appealing, they're welcome to reach out to me through the web form on my website, and I'm happy to give them a referral for somebody amazing in their state.
Perfect. Thank you so much again. And thank you for the time you spent. Any final thoughts, last minute things that you'd like to share with the audience?
If I could give you one gem to take with you, is when you're talking with your partner, think about how you can ask for what you need and you want rather than criticize or complain about what's already happening.
Nice. Ask for what you need or want instead of criticize or complain about what's happened.
The only response to criticism and complaint is to become defensive or to attack the other person, which leads to an argument, which usually leads to a tornado fight where you throw everything and the kitchen sink at each other, and it is simply not useful. So asking for what you don't want and need in a straightforward way where you express exactly what that looks like. So not, hey, can you take out the trash? It's, hey, can you take out the trash in the next 5 to 10 minutes because I am going to cook and it's full. So like being specific. What do you need and want and being specific?
Boom. Perfect. Thank you so much, Angela, again, for all of your time. Really appreciate it.
That was fun. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And thank you also, as always, to our live audience for tuning in. As a reminder, when we're live, you get no commercial interruptions, but the same cannot be said for the podcast downloads. So if you want to avoid the commercial interruptions, be sure to catch us live Monday through Wednesday, 2:30 Pacific time, or sign up for our Patreon where you get access to our commercial-free RSS feed and support the show. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and wherever it is that you download your podcast if you haven't already, and please leave us a review. Really sincerely appreciate it. One last time, thank you, Angela. Thank you, everybody. As always,
have a nice day. Thank you for tuning in to the Practicing Polyamory podcast. Would you or someone in your polycule like to be a guest? Sign up at practicingpolyamory.com and join the conversation. Please support us by subscribing, liking, and following us on social media at Practicing Polya by clicking any of the affiliate links on our website or by subscribing at